Hey everyone, and welcome back for another deep dive.
Glad to be here.
Today we're going to be tackling a topic that's pretty complex and honestly a little bit paradoxical.
It is.
It's the political status of Puerto Rico and its relationship with the U.S.
Right.
We've got this document that you shared called Puerto Rico.pdff,
Yeah.
and it really gets into the nuances of all this, and we're really excited to dive in.
Yeah. Looking forward to it.
So to kind of start us off, I think one of the biggest things that jumps out when we think about Puerto Rico is that, like, it's this place where you can be a U.S. citizen.
Right.
You can have a U.S. passport. You can travel freely to the States, but you can't vote for president.
Exactly.
So, like, what's going on there?
Yeah. That's one of the big paradoxes that we see in this whole story of Puerto Rico.
So to understand that, we need to back up a little bit and look at a few things.
Sure.
We need to look at where Puerto Rico is geographically, how it fits into the U.S. system, and what rights come with being a Puerto Rican citizen.
Yeah. We need to set the scene.
So first up, geography. Picture the Caribbean Sea, sun-drenched beaches, and nestled among islands like Cuba and Jamaica, you'll find Puerto Rico.
Right in the heart of the Greater Antilles.
The Greater Antilles. So this is this chain of islands in the Caribbean known for their beauty and their diverse cultures.
A lot of history there, too.
Yeah, absolutely. Now, in terms of size, Puerto Rico is actually similar to a country like Uruguay.
Uh-huh.
But here's the thing. It's packed with over 3 million people.
Wow.
Which is almost 20 times the population density of Uruguay.
That's a big difference.
It's a small island with a big personality, and that definitely plays into its political story.
Oh, yeah, for sure.
Okay, so now let's talk about this unusual status that Puerto Rico has.
Okay.
It's not an independent country, but it's not a U.S. state either.
Right.
So it's in this weird in-between space.
Exactly. It's kind of this unique category.
It's called a free associated state.
Yes, free associated state.
Which, I mean, what does that even mean?
Well, it means it's associated with the U.S., but not fully integrated.
Right, so there's this association, but there are strings attached.
You got it.
It's also sometimes called an organized but unincorporated territory.
Right, yeah.
Which puts it in a similar category to places like Guam.
Yeah, Guam, American Samoa.
So what does that mean in practice?
Well, it means they have some autonomy. They have their own constitution. They elect their own governor and legislature.
So they have a degree of self-governance?
Yeah. They even have their own Olympic team.
Wow.
But ultimately, it's still under U.S. federal authority.
Ah, so there's the catch.
Right there.
So this free association has these limitations, and it leads to this question of what rights do Puerto Ricans actually have?
Absolutely. And how are they represented?
Right, and how are they represented because they are U.S. citizens?
Exactly. So let's imagine two people to illustrate this.
Okay.
Let's imagine one person born in San Juan, Puerto Rico, and another person born in, let's say, Lebanon, Kansas.
Okay, got it. 2 U.S. citizens.
2 U.S. citizens, but their experiences are very different. So both of them, they hold U.S. passports, they can travel freely within the U.S., they pay federal taxes,
Okay.
and they can even participate in those Democratic and Republican primaries.
All right, so far so good.
But here's where the differences come in.
Okay, lay it on me.
The person from Kansas has full congressional representation. Senators, a representative in the House, and they can vote for president.
Of course.
But the person from San Juan, not so much.
What do they get?
They have a non-voting representative in Congress, and they can't vote in presidential elections.
Oh, wow. So they're U.S. citizens contributing to the system,
Yes,
but they don't get the same say.
that's the paradox.
And doesn't that clash with that whole, like, no taxation without representation thing?
Yeah, it is a big contradiction.
Yeah.
It's a core American value.
It is.
And it gets even weirder.
Okay. How so?
A Puerto Rican could become president of the United States
Seriously?
as long as they don't live in Puerto Rico.
So they can lead the country but not vote from their birthplace?
That's the reality.
That is so strange.
It is.
Okay, so even though they can't vote on the island itself, Puerto Ricans living in the 50 states can vote.
Right.
And there are millions of them, right?
Millions.
So their voices are heard in U.S. elections.
Absolutely. Their votes in those primaries can sway who becomes the presidential candidate,
That's true.
and they have a lot of voting power in those mainland states.
So it's like this indirect influence on U.S. politics.
Yeah.
Now, the document you shared argues that this situation is basically colonial.
Right.
And they point to a specific event that happened back in 2016.
Yes.
Puerto Rico was hit with this major financial crisis.
Huge debt crisis.
And to manage it, the U.S. federal government stepped in.
Yes, they did.
and established an oversight board
A financial oversight board
to oversee the island's finances.
to help them manage the debt.
So essentially, they took control of the purse strings.
Exactly.
And a lot of people saw that as an example of colonial control.
It definitely highlighted the power imbalance.
Yeah, it really raises the question of who's really in charge here.
For sure.
And with all this in mind, it's no wonder there's been so much debate about Puerto Rico's future.
Yeah, and the people have actually voted on their political status several times
Oh, really?
in these things called referendums.
So what have they chosen in the past?
Well, they've been offered a few different options, like independent statehood or keeping things the way they are.
So do these referendums actually change anything?
Well, that's where it gets complicated.
Okay.
They haven't been legally binding.
So even if a majority votes for something,
It doesn't automatically happen.
it's not a done deal.
The U.S. Congress would have to take action.
So it's more like gauging public opinion.
Yeah, seeing what people want.
Okay, I got it.
For example, in 2017, 97% of voters chose statehood.
97%.
Wow.
Ah.
But only 23% of eligible voters actually participated.
So even though it was a landslide,
Yeah,
it doesn't necessarily represent what everybody wants.
exactly. It's the problem with those non-binding referendums.
Okay, so mark your calendars because there's another referendum coming up.
Yes, there is.
On November 5th, 2024,
Big day.
same day as the U.S. presidential election,
Right alongside it.
things are going to be exciting.
For sure.
So what are the options this time around?
Well, this time they have 3 distinct paths they can choose from.
Yeah.
First, there's full independence.
Okay, so cutting all ties with the U.S.
Becoming a fully sovereign nation.
Wow, so going solo?
Exactly.
Okay, what's option number 2?
The complete opposite statehood.
So becoming the 51st state.
That's right, with all the same rights and responsibilities as any other state.
So they'd be fully integrated.
Fully integrated.
Wow, that would be a huge change.
It would.
Okay, and what about the third option?
This one's called sovereignty and free association.
Sovereignty and free association, what does that even mean?
Well, it's kind of like a middle ground.
Okay.
They get to run their own show,
Yeah.
make their own laws, but the U.S. is still kind of looking out for them.
So they'd still have some connection to the U.S.
Right, like a close partnership.
It sounds like each choice has its own set of pros and cons. And it's important to remember that until the U.S. Congress authorizes a binding referendum, these votes are really just about making their voices heard.
Exactly. It's about expressing what they want for the future.
Okay, so we've talked about where Puerto Rico is geographically. We've talked about this whole history of the relationship with the U.S.
Right.
We've talked about the referendums, but what about language?
Ooh, good question.
Because we've been talking about the U.S. where English is the dominant language.
Yeah.
But what about on the island itself?
Well, that brings us to another layer of this whole story.
Okay.
While the U.S. doesn't have an official language at the federal level,
Right.
Puerto Rico actually recognizes both Spanish and English as official languages.
So that they're bilingual.
In a sense, yes,
Yeah.
but the vast majority of Puerto Ricans are native Spanish speakers.
Really?
Yeah, English fluency isn't as widespread as you might think.
So even though they're U.S. citizens, Spanish is really the language of the people.
It is. It's the language of their culture.
That's fast.
It speaks to how they've held on to their cultural identity.
Even within this complex relationship.
Exactly.
Well, we've covered a lot of ground already in this first part of our deep dive.
We have.
We've gone from geography and history to these referendums and language.
Yeah, we've laid the groundwork.
We've laid the groundwork for understanding this whole political landscape.
We have.
But before we jump into part 2, I want to leave you with something to think about.
Okay.
As Puerto Rico prepares for this upcoming referendum, what factors do you think should matter most in choosing their path?
It's a big decision
It is a huge decision.
with long-lasting consequences.
Absolutely. So think about, what would statehood mean for their culture and identity?
Right.
Could they thrive economically if they were independent?
Good question.
Is free association the right balance, or is it too risky?
A lot to weigh.
So as you listen to the rest of this deep dive, put yourself in their shoes. Imagine you're a Puerto Rican facing these choices.
Yeah.
What future would you want to see?
It's a big question. Welcome back to our deep dive into the political landscape of Puerto Rico.
We've been exploring this unique relationship they have with the U.S.
And all the different ways it plays out in the lives of Puerto Ricans.
Now, one thing that really stood out to me
Yeah.
is this mass exodus we've seen of Puerto Ricans leaving the island.
Yeah, it's a big part of the story.
Millions have left over the past few decades.
Millions seeking better opportunities elsewhere.
And I think we touched on this briefly in the first part,
He did.
but I want to really dive deeper into what's driving this migration.
Sure.
What's pushing so many Puerto Ricans to leave their homeland?
Well, it's a lot of things happening all at once.
Yeah.
At the start of the 21st century, Puerto Rico's economy took a big hit.
Really? How so?
Well, it was the U.S. Congress, they eliminated some tax incentives that had brought a lot of investment to the island.
So these incentives were kind of like special deals to attract businesses.
Exactly. They were meant to encourage companies to set up shop in Puerto Rico.
And when they were removed, what happened?
It had a ripple effect.
Yeah.
Businesses closed, jobs disappeared.
Wow.
And people started struggling to make ends meet.
It's like someone pulled the rug out from under their economy.
Yeah, that's a good way to put it.
So then what happened?
Well, on top of that, they had this growing public debt crisis. So you have a shrinking economy and a mountain of debt.
That's a bad combination.
It is a very bad combination.
So what do they do about it?
Well, the U.S. federal government stepped in again.
Okay.
And they imposed these austerity measures.
Austerity measures, what does that even mean?
Think budget cuts, reduced public services layoffs of government employees.
So basically tightening the belt, trying to cut costs?
Exactly. And while the goal was to get that debt under control,
Yeah.
it often made things harder for ordinary Puerto Ricans.
It seems counterintuitive. You're trying to fix the economy, but you end up hurting the people.
And it happens a lot with those austerity policies.
So did it work?
Not really. In fact, it contributed to even more people leaving.
Because they were losing their jobs, they couldn't afford to live there.
Exactly. They felt like they had no choice but to go.
Then to make matters even worse, Hurricane Maria hit in 2017.
Oh, yeah. Maria was devastating.
Widespread devastation, even more hardship.
It just compounded all the existing problems.
So it's this combination of things.
The economic hardship, the austerity measures the natural disaster.
It all kind of came together.
It pushed a lot of people over the edge.
And remember, Puerto Ricans have the right to move freely within the U.S.
They do.
So many of them chose to relocate to the mainland.
For better job opportunities, affordable housing, a more stable future.
Makes sense when you're facing those kinds of challenges at home.
It becomes a matter of survival.
Yeah, absolutely. So how many people are we talking about here?
Millions over the past few decades.
Millions. Wow.
The population peaked in 2004 at around 3.8 million.
Okay.
Today, it's closer to 3.2 million.
That's a big drop. What does that mean for Puerto Rico in the long run?
Well, for one thing, it's created what we call a brain drain.
Brain drain.
Skilled workers, young professionals, entrepreneurs, they're leaving to pursue opportunities elsewhere.
So the people who could help rebuild the island are leaving.
That's the problem. It makes it harder to recover.
It's like this vicious cycle.
It is. Economic hardship leads to migration, which weakens the economy even further.
Yeah, and then there are the demographic consequences.
Right, you have an aging population, a shrinking tax base.
Which puts a strain on social services and everything else.
It's a tough situation all around.
So this exodus has had a huge impact on Puerto Rico.
But it's also had an impact on the mainland.
Oh, yeah, for sure.
This influx of Puerto Ricans has brought a lot of cultural enrichment and diversity to U.S. cities.
Right.
But it's also put a strain on resources in some areas.
Especially those that were already struggling.
Exactly. So it's a complex issue with ripple effects.
It really shows how interconnected everything is.
It does.
In Puerto Rico's political status, their relationship with the U.S.
Yeah.
It has real tangible effects on people's lives.
On both sides.
Okay, so now I want to shift gears a little bit and talk about language.
Okay.
Because we mentioned that Spanish is the dominant language in Puerto Rico.
It is.
Even though they have these close ties to the U.S.
Right.
So how have they managed to preserve their linguistic heritage?
Well, it's a testament to the strength of their culture.
Yeah.
Even though English is also an official language in Puerto Rico.
Right.
Spanish is what most people speak at home with their communities.
So it's really the language of the heart.
It is.
It's amazing.
And it plays a big role in the debate about Puerto Rico's future.
How so?
Well, for some people, preserving the Spanish language is a key reason why they support independence or sovereignty.
Because they see it as a way to protect their cultural identity.
Exactly. They worry that full integration into the U.S. would erode that identity.
It's like language becomes a symbol of resistance.
In a way, yes.
But for others, being bilingual is seen as an asset.
Right. It's a bridge between two worlds.
So it's a complex issue.
Very complex.
Now, before we wrap up this part of our deep dive, I want to go back to this idea of being caught between two worlds.
Yeah, we hear that a lot from Puerto Ricans.
Because they feel a connection to the U.S.
They do, a shared history, a sense of belonging.
But they also recognize their own distinct culture.
and their desire for self-determination.
It's like they're trying to figure out where they fit in.
Exactly. And ultimately, it's a decision they have to make for themselves.
And they'll have the opportunity to do that in the upcoming referendum.
On November 5th, 2024.
So they'll get to weigh the pros and cons of each option.
Independent statehood sovereignty.
And decide what kind of future they want.
For themselves and for future generations.
It's a pivotal moment.
It is a chance to shape their destiny.
So as we move into the final part of our deep dive, I want you to keep thinking about all the complexities we've discussed.
The history, the culture, the economics.
And put yourself in the shoes of a Puerto Rican.
Imagine you have to make this choice.
What would you decide? Okay, so we're back for the final stretch of our deep dive into Puerto Rican politics.
We've covered a lot of ground so far.
We really have.
From history and culture to economics and language.
Now with that referendum looming on the horizon,
just around the corner,
it's time to really dig into those potential futures for Puerto Rico.
Right. What are those options and what do they mean?
Exactly, because we've got those three choices on the table: independence, statehood, and sovereignty in free association.
Each one with its own unique set of opportunities and challenges.
It's a complex decision with no easy answers. So let's break it down one by one.
Sounds good.
Let's start with independence.
Okay.
The path of complete self-determination, forging their own destiny.
Going it alone.
It's a bold move, but what would that actually look like for Puerto Rico?
Well, imagine Puerto Rico as a fully sovereign nation.
Wow.
Charting its own course on the world stage.
Making their own rules.
Exactly. They'd have control over their own laws, their resources, their relationships with other countries.
So no more oversight from the U.S.?
Not at all. They could establish their own currency, enter into trade agreements with whoever they want.
So complete autonomy.
That's the idea.
It definitely sounds empowering, but I imagine there would be some bumps along the way.
Oh, there would be challenges.
Like what?
Well, one of the biggest concerns is economic stability.
Could they support themselves?
That's the question. Could they maintain a strong economy on their own?
Because right now they're part of the U.S. economic system.
Right. They benefit from that relationship.
So going independent would mean starting from scratch in many ways.
They'd have to manage their own finances, establish trade relationships, attract foreign investment.
That's a tall order.
It is, and there's definitely some risk involved.
Some might say it's too much risk.
It's a gamble for sure.
Right.
But others might say it's a chance to build something new, something that truly reflects their values.
Yeah, to break free from that dependence on the U.S.
Exactly. It's a chance to really control their own fate.
And what about security would they have to create their own military?
That's another big question right now. The U.S. military provides defense for Puerto Rico.
So they'd have to figure that out.
Either build their own defense forces or forge new alliances with other countries.
A lot to consider.
A lot on the table with independence.
Okay, well, let's move on to the second option, statehood.
Okay, the 51st state.
Fully integrated into the U.S. fabric.
All the way in.
And for a lot of Puerto Ricans, this is about equality.
It is. It's about having the same rights and responsibilities as any other U.S. citizen.
So no more of the second-class citizenship stuff.
Exactly. They would have full voting rights in all elections representation in Congress, equal access to federal programs and funding.
It sounds pretty appealing.
That does to a lot of people.
To finally have that equal footing.
To have a real say in the government that affects their lives.
But I imagine some people are worried about what they might lose in the process.
Of course there are concerns.
Like, what about their culture, their identity?
Yeah, would they still be Puerto Rican if they became a state?
Would they get absorbed into the melting pot?
Some people worry about that they fear losing their language, their traditions, their sense of who they are.
Because we've seen how cultures can change over time.
Especially when they're surrounded by a more dominant culture.
So it's a trade-off.
It is gaining political power, but potentially losing some of that cultural uniqueness.
A tough decision for sure.
It is, but proponents of statehood argue that you can maintain your culture even within a larger framework.
They point to states like Hawaii.
Right. Hawaii has a strong cultural identity, even though they're a state.
So it's possible.
It is. It all depends on how they approach it.
Okay, let's move on to the final option, which might be the most complex.
Sovereignty and free association.
It's like a hybrid approach, right?
Exactly. It's kind of this middle ground between independence and statehood.
Trying to have the best of both worlds.
That's the goal.
So how would that actually work?
Well, think of it like two sovereign nations entering into a mutually beneficial agreement.
So they'd be their own entity.
With their own government and their own constitution.
But they'd still have close ties to the U.S.
Right. They might retain access to certain U.S. programs and benefits.
But they'd have control over their own internal affairs.
For the most part.
And what about defense? Would the U.S. still protect them?
That would likely be part of the agreement.
So it's a balancing act.
It is trying to find that sweet spot between autonomy and partnership.
It sounds appealing to some people.
They see it as a way to achieve self-governance without all the economic risks of full independence.
While still maintaining that connection to the U.S.
Right.
Yeah.
But as we mentioned earlier, there are some concerns about this option too.
Like, it's a bit vague.
Yeah, there are a lot of details that would need to be worked out.
Like, how much autonomy would they actually have?
And what would happen to U.S. citizenship?
And how would disputes be resolved?
It's all very much up in the air.
So a lot of potential, but also a lot of uncertainty.
That's a good way to put it.
And one more thing to consider.
Yeah.
Each of these options has different implications for U.S. citizenship. Independence would likely mean renouncing U.S. citizenship.
While statehood would grant full and equal citizenship.
And free association is somewhere in between.
Yeah, it's a gray area.
So much to think about.
It's a complex issue.
Well, as we wrap up this deep dive, I have to ask you, what do you think?
I can't take sides here.
Of course.
Our job is to present the information and let you, the listener, form your own opinion.
That's fair, but you've obviously spent a lot of time thinking about this.
I have.
So what are some key things you think Puerto Ricans should consider as they make this decision?
Well, I think it boils down to a few fundamental questions.
Okay.
First, what kind of future do they want for themselves, for their children, for their grandchildren?
What are their hopes and dreams?
Exactly what values are most important to them.
And what kind of relationship do they want to have with the U.S.?
Because it's going to be different depending on which path they choose.
It's about figuring out who they are and where they belong.
It's a process of self-discovery.
And then there's the practical side of things.
Right? They need to think about the potential consequences of each option.
The economic impact, the security challenges, the impact on their culture and identity.
You need to make informed choices.
Not just emotional ones.
Right.
And I think it's also important to approach this with an open mind.
Yeah.
And a willingness to listen to different perspectives.
To have those difficult conversations.
Because this is a decision that will affect everyone on the island.
It will, regardless of how they vote.
So they need to find a way to come together.
To bridge those divides and work towards a shared future.
Well said.
Because at the end of the day, this is a human story.
It is.
It's about people striving for a better life for themselves and their families.
And trying to find their place in the world.
Exactly. And no matter what happens in that referendum, one thing is clear.
What's that?
The story of Puerto Rico is far from over.
It's a nation at a crossroads.
Ready to write the next chapter.
Well said. So, to our listeners, thank you for joining us on this journey into the heart of Puerto Rican politics.
We hope you learned something new.
We hope you gained a deeper understanding of this complex issue and that it's sparked your curiosity to learn even more.
Because there's always more to explore.
Absolutely. So keep those conversations going, keep thinking critically, keep engaging with these important issues.
Because the future of Puerto Rico is still being written.
And we're all part of that story in one way or another.
Thanks for diving deep with us.